Here's a quote from Meg's History of Graphic Design, which is one of the sources I've used to put this together. It's a great text on the history of print media. In 1415, the Duke of Milan played cards with ivory slats bearing images painted by famous artists, and Flemish nobles used engraved silver plates. Throughout Europe, the working class gathered in taverns and by the roadside to play with grimy cards that were block printed or stenciled on coarse paper. Playing cards were the first printed pieces to move an illiterate culture, making them to move into an illiterate culture, making them the earliest European manifestation of printing's democratizing ability. The games of kings could now become the games of peasants and craftsmen. So here we have in Europe the first printed image that common people are having experiences with are playing cards. Because these cards introduced the masses to symbol recognition, sequencing, and logical deduction, their intrinsic value transcended idle entertainment. Again, this is a universal system. The clubs, the hearts, the spades, the numbers, the individual characters meaning something specific. It's a universal, well, at least, in each sort of society, way of communicating. It's a standardized system that's organized, that can be reprinted in slightly different ways and still understood. It's a really major leap forward in terms of literacy and in terms of education and helping populations understand symbols and sequences and logic. So the printed image is not only something that is democratizing immediately, it's taking this game of kings and making it available to the working class, but it's also democratizing knowledge and education from its very beginning. So, in the early days of European printing, and again, this is about 1300, 1250 to 1450, block books became fairly popular. So this is again a xylographic type of a print. Individual pages were carved on one block of wood. These were sort of like comic books, and they had simplified images that told the story along with text that explained the story. One of the most famous types of block books was Ars Memorandi. These were basically religious texts that were designed to help people with death. But they also must be considered an early example of printed propaganda, for it urges the dying to put aside the desire to provide for one's family, to will one's estate to the church. So again, printmaking has this inherently political basis. It's democratizing information, it's democratizing knowledge, but it can also be used to reinforce power structures. The church, which was a very powerful organization in medieval Europe, had money. They had access to printing and people who were literate. They were able to make books, produce them, and they were able to spread this information to the masses. And in this case, these Ars Memorandi books were created and distributed and said to be used to comfort the dying, but in fact, they had a message slipped in there that was about giving the church all your money. This is happening during the Black Death. This becomes very popular. And so the idea of death is all around people. It's something they're seeing and experiencing and thinking about all the time. And the church is capitalizing on, unfortunately, a pandemic. And this could be an interesting paper topic as well, seeing as we're in a pandemic right now, perhaps, thinking about that or considering how media changes the meaning of pandemic or death. Propaganda, just to define it, is of course information of a biased or misleading nature used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. The word does actually come through its use in religious context in the early 1600s. Pope Gregory the 15th created an organization, the Congregation for Propagating the Faith. So the word propaganda has this sort of religious background, but it's very much tied to printed media. Having information that's able to spread is inherent to propaganda. So as printmaking continues to take off in Europe, and books and posters and pamphlets are cheap and accessible as people begin to learn how to read because printed material is available, propaganda is something that can exist. So it's important as you think about printmaking to remember that the medium is inherently political. It has, from its inception, been used by governments and power structures to move ideas, while at the same time having, the other side of the coin is that it's been very democratizing and increased access to information and knowledge and literacy. So just to hammer home how much Europe changed in a very short period of time, in 1424, Cambridge, the university, had only 122 books, and a book was worth as much as a farm or a vineyard. Here's some graph I pulled off the internet about the value of a vineyard. In current dollars, we have two different vineyards that are worth $3.5 million and $9 million respectively. The point is, books were worth huge amounts of money because even though printmaking and paper had made their way to Europe, it was still very slow to create and produce books. Imagine if you wanted to produce the Bible, but in order to do that, you had to carve every single page out of a block of wood with that text. You need artisans to do the carving, you need scribes who are able to write. Most of the books at this time are illuminated manuscripts, so they're handwritten. Often they were made on parchment. They were very detailed, they were not easy to reproduce, and so their value was incredible. Again, with a book being worth huge sums of money, people don't have access to it. Even in university had just over 100 books. The church had access to literacy, but very few people were able to access the written word. Several factors created a climate in Europe that made typography feasible. The demand for books had become insatiable, again, driving up their price. There was an emerging middle class, and there were students who were expanding universities. So there was a vast new market for reading material. But bookmaking was still a slow and expensive process that had changed little in 1,000 years. A simple 200-page book required 4 or 5 months' labor by a scribe. It required 25 sheepskins for parchment, so that means 25 lambs had to be slaughtered, and weeks of time had to be used to tan or to dry out those hides. And the parchment was even more expensive than the scribe's labor. So this is how illuminated manuscripts were made. It was a slow, expensive process that did not lend itself to reproduction. Each one could be made individually. And again, by this point, there's some amount of block printing, there's some amount of xylography, there are small Ars Memorandi type books being made. But even that process, which is bringing down the cost, it's not something that can be done on a large scale. You can't make books with hundreds or thousands of pages in that style. So in comes Johannes Gutenberg, and this is, of course, the man who is often credited with inventing printmaking, though we'll see that's a little bit of a misnomer and the whole story is a little bit more complicated. But Gutenberg was a jeweler in Germany. He had great understanding of metal casting and metalworking, and that's what allowed him to create movable type and basically invent a process that hardly changed for 500 years. Gutenberg developed a casting method for consistent metal type. The font used at that time was Textura, which was kind of a Gothic looking font. If you Google that, you can see some images of it. And he was able to cast consistent metal types. So again, his detailed metalwork as a jeweler allowed him to make letters that were even in their height, they were even in their shape, they were very well engineered, which made it very easy to lay them out, to put out words. The lines were even sizes. Another of Gutenberg's contributions is he created an ink. Previously, folks were using mostly like a watercolor type material, and Gutenberg made a thick ink from boiled linseed oil that would adhere well to the metal. And the most important thing that Gutenberg did is he created a very sturdy press. Up until now, most typography and xylography was being done by hand, maybe with some basic contraptions to create pressure. But Gutenberg created an extremely hardy wooden press that allowed for high amounts of pressure to happen rapidly instead of someone having to run their hand or run a tool that would burnish the paper onto the print in a slow, individual way. One of Gutenberg's most important contributions that you may have heard of was the Gutenberg Bible. Again, this is an era where the church, the Catholic Church, has a huge amount of power in Europe. People are hungry to have information, to read the scriptures themselves. Hang on one sec. Shh. Okay, I'm back. The Gutenberg Bible was also known as the 42-line Bible. It was printed with 2 columns of text and 42 lines each. This is again a fairly similar layout to a lot of text that we see today. This columns of text, well-organized type, which again is allowed by those very precisely crafted individual letters. It was designed to mimic a manuscript, possibly even sold as a handmade manuscript to appear more expensive, because at this time books are still worth a lot of money. So having a book that was handmade that could be passed off as a manuscript was a way of showing how worldly and wealthy you were. The columns were evenly justified to allow spacing and abbreviation. If we think about justified type now, if you go into Microsoft Word and you justify your text, that's when both edges are straight against the margin and neither side is ragged. So that was something that was created in the Gutenberg Bible. And there were large margins and spaces between the columns, which allowed for handmade decoration. So you could still take a printed book and add some elements of an illustrated manuscript to it. The 42-line Bible had no title page, no page numbers, nor other innovations to distinguish it from handmade manuscripts. Both Gutenberg and his customers probably wanted it this way. When the French observed the number and conformity of the volumes, they thought witchcraft was involved. To avoid indictment and conviction, Fust, who was a printer that worked with Gutenberg, was forced to reveal his secret. So again, when these very regular, exact, repeating letters were shown to people, they could not possibly fathom how something could be made so perfectly. In fact, there was a belief that possibly witchcraft was involved in creating a book which had such precise, repeatable letters. So that's where we're going to stop this today. I will send you all another lecture on the history of printmaking this week. But for now, I would like you to watch this 3 minutes of a video link I'm sending you. It's a series called How We Got to Now, excuse me. And I'd like you to watch minutes 15 through 18. And that's sort of where we'll pick up for the next lecture. So go ahead and be thinking about your paper topic. Let Keo and I know if you have any questions. And I will be back soon with another lecture.